Hi, everyone. Russell Daniels, the Digital Communications Director at Open Primaries. We are going to get started now. Thank you so much for joining today's call. A progressive Democrat and a conservative Republican make the case for open primaries. Feature Senator Chloe Maxmin and Joe Kirby. Just for a quick bio on our two guests today, Joe Kirby. Joe is a retired prominent business leader and longtime government reform advocate in South Dakota. He helped lead the successful change of Sioux Falls city government in the 1990s, played a leadership role in the 2016 ballot campaign to create top two nonpartisan elections in South Dakota, which almost passed with 45% of the vote. He's a lifelong Republican who believes strongly in the importance of competition in every arena. He recently penned a powerful op-ed that has spread across the country, challenging his party to embrace electoral competition just as it has embraced market competition. And Senator Chloe Maxman. Senator Maxman caught the attention of many in November when she unseated Maine's GOP Senate Minority Leader Dana Dow with 51% of the vote in a rural working class District 13. She built her campaign around talking with and knocking on the doors of not only Democrats, but many Republicans and independents. And she realized that many of her constituents shared the same values, regardless of their political affiliation, which is why she's sponsoring Maine's semi-open primary bill, LD 231, to make sure every voice is included. She described LD 231 as one of the simplest and most profound ways we can build a more inclusive democracy for Maine. We are so excited to have both of them on the call today. Before I turn things over to Open Primaries President John Optek, just a quick reminder, there is a Q&A today. It happened about halfway through the call. So please, during the call, if you have a question, put your name and state in the chat, a brief summary of your question, and we'll get to as many of those as possible during the call today. Thank you all so much for joining us, and I will turn things over to John. Take it away, John.
Thanks, Russ. Welcome, Joe and Chloe. Really appreciate both of you taking some time out of your day. I know, Senator Maxman, you're in the midst of the legislative session, and it can't be easy to spend some time with us, so really appreciate that. Just before we dive in, I've been thinking about talking with the two of you and my kind of personal excitement about this conversation. And thinking how I wanted to share that. And I think what it stems from is I have such respect for both of you and your willingness in different ways. And you're obviously in Maine and South Dakota, very different states, very different politics, but both of you have shown this willingness to go up against conventional wisdom and go up against your own party when what they're doing doesn't serve the kind of the needs of your communities. And I wanted to explore that and talk about your both of your connections to political reform. But I just wanted to let you both know how brave and courageous I think it is in today's world, in which the dominant political pressure is to, conform to the norms of partisan politics, to go by the playbook, the Republican playbook or the Democratic playbook. And I really think that the future of our country is from the rule breakers, by people like yourselves who are willing to pose questions and say, hey, doing it the conventional way is not getting us anywhere. Why don't we open up new conversations and try some new things? So again, thank you both for being here, and I hope we can have that conversation. So I wanted to start off, and Russell mentioned this, Chloe, your race, which you won in a big upset. You won in a district that Trump, you ran as a progressive Democrat in a district that Trump overwhelmingly won in 2020. And I was reading an article that you gave to the Nation magazine. I just want to read a quote from it. So this is what you said in the Nation. You said, "One thing is clear as we canvass rural roads, talking to Republicans, independents, Democrats, and the unregistered, the left abandoned rural America, leaving its citizens behind." So I wanted to hear more of how you think about that. There's just so much written about how the American people have, self-sorted into red and blue, but you seem to be painting a very different picture of a Democratic Party, your own party, which has abandoned rural Americans. So are you having this kind of fight or this dialogue in progressive circles? What's that look like?
That's such a good question. And I'm so grateful to be here with everybody today. I mean, I grew up in rural Maine in a small town of 1,600 people on my family's farm. And I've just always loved where I'm from. And one of the things that I appreciated later in life is that when the way that I was raised, we never talked about party. We talked about, are you a good neighbor? Do you show up? Are you kind? Or, all of those values that are really the heart of rural communities. And it wasn't until I got to college that I realized there was such disdain for Republicans amongst the progressive movements. But it was also really tricky because I found myself, I am a registered Democrat, and I found myself organizing in those progressive movements, but at the same time realizing that they were leaving behind my hometown and my community, and that the way that these movements were organizing were inclusive in many ways, but also exclusive in a lot of ways. And I always knew I wanted to go home to my hometown and live there and build my life there, but I didn't know how to bring all of this work that I had learned back to my rural community. And I think what I realized when I started campaigning back in 2018 is that we didn't use any resources from the state party. We created our own canvassing universe. We did all of our own graphic design and mailers and palm cards. I mean, we literally did everything ourselves because we recognize that the Democrats do not perform well in rural America. And so what we found when we did that is that we ended up knocking on the doors of Republicans and independents. In 2020, we were told straight up that the Democrats do not knock on Republican doors in Maine. But we did. And I found that on my little canvassing app, I could see that every day, so many people that I was talking to had never been contacted by a Democratic candidate or a Democratic canvasser in their entire voting history. And that realization and talking with all of these folks completely changed my identity. So I find myself in progressive spaces trying to say, hey, we're leaving out all of these folks who are desperate for their voices to be heard. They are just as frustrated with government's inefficiencies and breakdowns as we are, but we're not talking to them. And we're not talking to them because we're scared, because we have implicit bias. I mean, why aren't we going and talking to these folks? And so it kind of loops back to the open primaries conversation, because I think that the Democrats and the Republicans keeping the party conversation so insular is actually destructive on so many levels. And this is one way that we can open it up and make sure that more folks are being heard on both sides to try and bridge some of these huge chasms that we see all around us these days.
That's fascinating. Thanks for sharing that, Chloe. Joe, I want to turn things over to you for a minute. So you wrote an editorial a number of weeks ago that it's actually been gaining some traction nationally. It's been picked up by a number of different publications, both in South Dakota and around the country. And I want to read you a quote from your own piece. You say, quote, "We need to develop the incentives for new voices to be heard. Not because I necessarily agree with them, but because they would challenge our Republican Party to think deeper and do better." So there are reforms that go a long way towards that goal. Alaska, Washington, and Nebraska all have different forms of nonpartisan open primaries that require all candidates to compete on an even footing and let all voters vote, end quote. So I was really taken aback by this, Joe, because it's so rare in this political moment, in this environment, for someone to speak out in favor of more voices, more choices, even voices they disagree with. So how did you get there? What led you to this this particular position about the need for more voices in South Dakota politics?
Well, I live in a very conservative state. We're a red state. I think we'll always be a red state. We've always been a red state. I'm not afraid of hearing alternative ideas. Our Republican Party here has strong belief in basic American values. We believe in competition, the free market system. In fact, we kind of enjoy stealing business and businesses from neighboring states because of the wide open competitive market we have in South Dakota. We have very little government, very little regulation. And so it seems ironic to me that in a state like this, we have a minority of the voters, the Republican Party, dominating everything, not open to new ideas. Too many debates in our legislature are between the right and the far right. It has nothing to do with the rest of us in the state. We're not all right or far right. There's a lot of us that are moderate, and we're ignored. We don't have a voice. All the state offices are controlled by the right. All the federal offices are controlled by the right. And we don't get an open discussion of topics of potential interest and where we might actually learn something from the other side.
You know, I remember, just to follow up on that, we talked a couple of years ago about you said this thing to me. You said, on the one hand, I approve of most of the policy that's coming out of the legislature in South Dakota. You know, it's low taxes, low regulation, things that you support. But you painted a picture of how much shenanigans the legislature was getting into, how much waste and kind of missed opportunities because there was so little competition, because most of these people ran unopposed, or all they had to do was win a low turnout primary and then they were in office. Paint that picture for everybody about like what the legislative process looks like given the lack of competition in South Dakota.
Well, yeah, we have 35 or 36 legislative districts, 2 House members from each one and 1 senator from each one. And in many cases, there isn't a Democrat to run against somebody, and the party generally picks who's going to run. So in most, I'd say 85, 90% of the cases, the Republican is a shoe-in, whoever gets picked by the party. So there's no real vetting of politicians in our state by the populace. It's the Republican Party that makes all the choices. So we don't have true democracy. We have a monopoly run by the Republican Party, which is out of touch with most of us in the state.
Got it. A question for both of you. So right now, I know, Chloe, you're working to enact an open primaries, a semi-open primaries bill through the legislature, and that seems to be going very well. Joe, we worked together in 2016 on the effort for Top 2, which got very close. And I know you're active now working on open primaries and ranked choice voting in South Dakota. So just each of you take a minute and kind of paint a picture of what's happening in Maine and South Dakota on these issues.
Sure thing. I have a handy dandy link that I will put in the chat so that folks can follow along and see what we're doing. So our bill number is LD 231, an act to establish semi-open primaries. We have been working really hard on this bill. A really similar one was introduced last session, but it woefully failed. And so we're trying to learn from those lessons and really build this one up. We have co-sponsors on both sides of the aisle. It's looking really positive. I think it's been really interesting for me to work with the Democratic Party and make sure that and for both parties, that the party can keep that identity that so many people are attracted to while allowing independents to vote in the primaries. So we're doing that. I think we're going to have our final committee work session on it this week or early next week, and then it will come up for a vote and sometime before June 16th, and we adjourn, and we'll see how it goes. But the best way to follow along would be by looking at Open Primaries Maine.
And in South Dakota, we don't have any effort underway right now. We do have a group that's building to support ranked choice voting, and as we grow our group and create a bigger and stronger group, we're hoping to get into other election reform ideas like open primaries once again. The effort in 2016 failed because we tried to do too much, I think. We had open primaries combined with removing the labels so the candidates could not say that they were a Democrat or a Republican, and that was our Achilles heel. And in spite of that, we still got 45% support. And I think we were teed up to do a simple open primaries initiative, put it on the ballot in 2017 for the 2018 election, but our funding and our organization stumbled and we just didn't get it done. We didn't get the petition drive done in time. So we missed an opportunity, but we know that, we have a little more education. The longer you go between efforts, you have to re-educate the public on what open primaries and ranked choice voting are, but I think we can do it.
That sounds great. And if you guys can hear some background noise, my dog is deciding to dig a hole in our rug. I don't know why, but if it comes through, apologize. I apologize to everyone. All right, I want to ask you guys to indulge me in a somewhat philosophical question here. This is something that's been troubling me, and I would really appreciate your thoughts on this. So, the issue of kind of a federal response to some of the efforts to limit voting participation is kind of come together in a bill, HR 1, which is an 800-page bill that extends voting hours, guarantees absentee ballots, early voting, you can't purge people, a whole set of things, most of which I support. The thing that worries me about it is that it's combined with a bunch of things that have nothing to do with reform or voters. They have to do with kind of cementing party control of the system. But my question is this, like in Maine, Chloe, you're getting Democrats and Republicans to support this. You're kind of self-consciously organizing a bipartisan coalition and bringing the voices of independents in. But if you look at Congress, there's like not a single Republican co-sponsor of that legislation. And in my mind, if you can't reform politics from a party perspective, you have to broaden the lens and include more people. Otherwise, it's not reform, even if some of the individual items that are in that bill are good and they're positive. But this just annoys me. And yet I feel like nobody's talking about this. Like it's just the content of the bill that's important, as opposed to the process of passing the bill. But am I making a mountain out of a molehill here? How do you both think about this federal conversation?
If I can start.
Go for it, Joe.
I see 2020 was such a weird year with the pandemic, and people didn't know how to run their elections for sure. Courts got involved when maybe they shouldn't have, because the election laws were pretty understood in various localities. The election wasn't stolen, but it certainly created a lot of questions with some of the impulses people had to try and fix things going into the pandemic election. Again, I think this is a solution looking for a problem. Our local election laws are generally okay. They're in place. We don't need the feds to come along. And it's certainly not a good idea for one party to shove it, a big fix into place for the whole country, which is exactly a symptom of the whole problem we have. Is when one party is in charge, they're totally in charge, and it's a winner take all mentality that I'd like to see go away, where we learn to work together a little better.
Yeah, it's so interesting, because when I campaign or growing up in my community, I mean, I know I said this before, but we just so rarely talk about party. When I first got access to the voter database, I looked up all my honorary grandparents, and they were all registered Republicans, and I really wanted to bring that spirit into politics of, let's form a relationship based on our values and the fact that we love our state and we're all trying to do the best work, instead of immediately identifying each other on party. But something happens when you're in a system that is built to divide. And so the partisanship at the state level, and certainly at the federal level, is really toxic. I find it really awful to be around. I have some really amazing relationships with my Republican colleagues, but there is still that fighting that you just can't avoid. And I think that I think a lot of that model is set at the federal level, that we constantly see Democrats and Republicans fighting each other, and there are very few examples of something different. Maybe there can't be something different, but I really do think that trickles down. And so I think it's really unfortunate that there isn't bipartisan support or conversation around these incredibly important reforms for our democracy that benefit everybody. And I do think that has an impact on the work that we're trying to do at the state level. You know, it becomes your party becomes more of an identity than part of who you are, and I think that's really, really unfortunate. Yeah, I would also say that watching automatic voter registration go on online in other states, for example, or just the vast majority of folks are registering as unenrolled voters. And I think both parties need to look at that and say, clinging to our Ds and our Rs is actually really destructive for our parties in the long run. And we have to start thinking about how to do this work in a different way.
That's great. One final question, and then I want to turn it over to the audience. So following up on what you just said, Chloe, the kind of the growth and the rise of unenrolled vote or independent voters, people that don't want to join a political party. What do you both think is, because that's happening in every state in the country. That's not regional. It's also not, ideological. It's happening in conservative communities and progressive communities. What's driving that?
I can go take a crack at that one first. I think, I'm a registered Democrat and I have a hard time with it. I think that the parties have become so enmeshed in money and corporate donations and power struggles, that they've become really exclusive spaces to me. And so, I frequently vote with my Republican colleagues because I think that they're better serving rural communities. I don't think that the Democrats have a really good analysis of what rural America needs and what kind of policies are going to work here. And so when you don't see your community and your community's needs reflected in a party, why would you be part of that party? And I think for young folks, for example, I've spent my entire life being furious at every single person that I've ever seen be elected because they've done nothing, especially on the, that's a bit of an exaggeration. I'm getting myself a little worked up here, but my background is around the climate crisis and watching generations of politicians, especially at the federal level, refuse to take action, and especially, for me, some of the Democrats that I was hopeful for, like Obama, to just watch that hope be squashed. I don't see a solid path forward for the Democratic Party unless there is a massive reform and reorientation to these communities that have been left out of the conversation. So I don't blame people for not wanting to be part of a party. I struggle with it sometimes, but I think it's a system that we're stuck with. And so we have to do the best that we can. And, that means being more inclusive.
And in South Dakota, we have 48% Republicans and about a fourth are independents and fourth are Democrats, but those aren't real numbers. Those are how people have registered. A lot of independents register as Republicans because that's the only election that matters most of the time. And so the number of Democrats is probably artificially low in our state. Who knows how many, if you really got a true polling of South Dakotans, where people would fall out. But I suspect the Republican numbers would come down. And Republican in South Dakota means crazy right-wing Republican too often in our legislature, where they're debating who gets to go into what bathroom or who can play in sports and crazy stuff that doesn't have much to do with running our state properly. So, at the end of the day, I don't blame the politicians. They've all been elected by the system we've got in place. They're playing by the rules. It's up to us. There's better alternatives for selecting our leaders. We need to find a way to get the rules changed. And there are good models now around the country for better ways to select your leaders.
Got it. All right, I want to open it up. We have a lot of questions in the queue. Before we do that, though, I have a word from our co-sponsor. I just want to thank the Bridge Alliance for co-sponsoring today's discussion. The Bridge Alliance is a very innovative national organization made up of over 80 individual organizations of groups that are working to change the culture of politics and the structure of politics. And the Bridge Alliance is building bridges between these communities, between these organizations, and helping to amplify the overall power of the culture change and the structural change movement. So thank you, Bridge Alliance, for co-sponsoring today's discussion. All right, our first question is from Maine. This is Claire from Brooksville. She has a question about the campaign there. Go ahead, Claire, take it away. You got to take yourself off mute, Claire, and ask your question. Claire? All right, we'll come back to Claire. Second question, this is from Rachel in Chicago. Has a question about how to organize people. Go ahead, take it away, Rachel.
Sure. Hi, my question is for both Chloe and Joe. So when you are trying to convince people to support open primaries, how does your messaging differ when your audience is Republicans versus Democrats, especially because I think a lot of voters think that reforms and innovations like this one are run by the left, which is certainly not the case. So especially for Joe, how would you message this reform to a Republican audience?
Well, I don't recall that we messaged it differently for either. We're in a small state, and we just had a single message that fairness issue, let everybody vote, since most voters didn't get to vote in the only election that really mattered, the Republican primary. It was kind of taking the Republicans head on. Bigger states, you might have the luxury of messaging different groups a little better than we did. Again, my letter that challenged the Republican Party recently, I've not heard one negative comment. I think it resonated with a lot of Republicans. So I think we don't need to tread too carefully on these unreasonable Republicans. They're open-minded. If you start talking about fairness and letting everybody vote, it's attractive to everybody, I think.
Yeah, and for the Democrats, like, the biggest refrain that I've heard from some of my colleagues is that if you want to vote in a primary, then you should just register and be part of the party. It's like a privilege of being part of the party is you get to vote in a primary that every single taxpayer pays for. But that just is like a very odd line of thinking to me because so many Democrats stand up for inclusivity and voter access and all this kind of stuff. And that's kind of the antithesis of that argument. So I just try and push back a little bit on that one.
Thank you.
All right, we have a question from Riley about the connection between open primaries and ranked choice voting. Go ahead, Riley.
Hi. I was wondering how closely tied various efforts toward implementing open primaries are with implementing ranked choice voting at the same time. Because I know I worry about if there's no ranked choice voting, then an open primary could just go to the party who has the discipline to run only one candidate.
Any thoughts, Joe, Chloe?
No, we're too early in our process to even be thinking about that. We're just trying to rebuild a group to start talking about election reform in general. And I certainly like what I've seen that model in Alaska, but trying to explain both ranked choice voting and open primaries at the same time seems like taking on a bigger hurdle. And that's, again, what we found in 2016. We tried to explain making something nonpartisan and open primaries at the same time, and it kind of got us trying to explain too much all at once.
Yeah, really similar situation here. There is a bill in to create the open primary ranked choice voting system, but there's just not the interest in it. It's a bit too complicated for folks, I think. The appeal of the semi-open primary model is just really simple. It's just all about an unenrolled voter getting a ballot that has party candidates on it.
I think just maybe to chime in here, Riley, what I'm excited about is there is a very rich and robust conversation about creative ways to combine these issues when it's appropriate. So we got this done in Alaska. We got top 4 with ranked choice voting and dark money disclosure. I think part of the debate is, do you now try to take Alaska and make that okay, that's what we're going to do in every state? Or do you adopt a more, hey, local dynamics, local politics, local laws, local customs, and work with people to choose a model that works for them? So that's what we're doing in Maine. Maine, if we tried to take Alaska and just dump it on Maine, it would be a disaster. But I think I think this is very healthy. There is a recognition that there is no silver bullet reform out there, that we need to look at primaries, ranked choice voting, gerrymandering reform, campaign finance reform, ranked choice approval. Like that we need a holistic approach, and one reform is not going to accomplish everything. And I think that's very positive. All right, Claire has gotten out of digital.
Hope you can hear me now.
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead, take it away, Claire.
I have a question for Senator Maxman. How can those of us in Maine help you with our efforts to enact semi-open primaries in Maine? And a related question is, how can those not in Maine help those of us in Maine get this legislation passed? Thank you.
Great question, Claire. I will put again in the chat the link to the Open Primaries Maine Facebook page, which is where a lot of the information is going. I would say #1 thing for Mainers to do is to reach out to your state rep and state senator and try and see if they support semi-open primaries. If not, try and convince them to, and then let me know. We have a vote tracker, so we'll be sure that it will pass. We're also doing a lot of letter writing, letters to the editor. We've been doing a lot of events, so there's a lot of stuff to get looped into, and it will all be on the Facebook page, as well as the website that I posted earlier. And excuse me, for folks not in Maine, I think if you know people in Maine, then you could reach out and have them reach out to their legislators. But I think it's important for events like this just to, I think in Maine and in our legislature, there's not, people want to feel comfortable. They want to make sure we're not doing something overtly out there. And so I think just making this a more normalized standard conversation is really important.
All right, we have a question from Harry Kresge in New York about the difference between nonpartisan and bipartisan. Go ahead, Harry.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
This is something that I get more and more kind of in touch with and watching mainly what's happening in Washington. So it's very polarized. It's very close in terms of Democrats and Republicans, although the Democrats control presidency, House, and Senate. So part of me says, well, gee, I wish things could be bipartisan, but then since I generally lean left of center, bipartisan means sacrificing some of the more, quote, progressive aspects of the legislation that's on the table. But there really is a difference between nonpartisan and bipartisan. So what do people do, or what do we think if we really are basically anti-party, because we've seen how partisanship, whether it's from the right or the left or the Democrats or the Republicans, is so hurtful? How do we prevent being seduced by bipartisanship? What do we say about that? How do we deal with that? How do we think about that? Is this just a personal problem? Is it a philosophical issue? Is it a real politic issue? How do we address that?
Me to give a shot here. I'll take a first shot.
Go for it.
We tried doing something nonpartisan in South Dakota. We tried removing the labels, and we found out how important labels are to so many people. They want to keep their identity as a Republican or a Democrat or even an independent. So nonpartisan didn't fly. Bipartisan, I think, is a worthy goal. How we accomplish that, I think, is by changing the election systems. In my state, the election system rewards partisanship. If a Republican is not Republican enough, he gets taken to the primary by somebody else in the party. We got to get away from election systems that reward partisanship so that we can have more bipartisanship.
Yeah, and I think I really agree with that. And, I really used to think of partisanship as a linear spectrum, so that if someone on the left was working with someone on the right, that you were kind of like bending a little bit to meet them all the way over here, and that it was a compromise or a compromise of values. And certainly that happens, but I see it at kind of a little bit more circular, or at least definitely not linear. And I think there's a lot of space that we haven't really explored, where we don't have to sacrifice our values in the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, but we can still work together in really productive ways. And I think maybe some of the language that we use might not sound the same as if we weren't taking that approach. And not everyone wants to take that approach, which is totally okay. But I think finding that space is really important, especially in more rural communities that feel left out of the left side of the conversation. There can still be a lot of meaning and good work there.
So nonpartisanship is a hopeless pipe dream in our current political situation. That's what I'm hearing.
Maybe.
I mean, I have a lot of sympathy for what you're saying, Harry, and I think that I part of what I hear Joe and Chloe saying is, in some ways, given where we are, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but or summarize this, but given where we are, if we can move things forward in terms of, we still have this kind of 200-year-old two-party system that's not going away next Thursday. If we could create some space for new types of configurations within that, maybe one of the consequences is it creates some openings for actually addressing that question of nonpartisanship. That's how I think about it. But I don't think it's a hopeless cause. It's just maybe it's not a next Thursday cause. How about that?
Hopefully I'll be around on Friday.
Yeah. Question from Sue Davies about the kind of the nitty gritty of the legislative process up in Maine. Go ahead, Sue, from New Jersey.
Hello. I love listening to both of you. So I'm in New Jersey. We don't have initiative in referendum, so we have to work through the state legislature in order to enact any reforms. I'm with New Jersey Independent Voters, and we are working in both on open primaries, but also on a combined ranked choice voting and open primaries issue. What I was interested in hearing from actually both of you is a little more about how do those conversations go with other legislators about open primaries and about challenging that? And if you have any advice for us on how to tackle this issue in a non-INR state.
Yeah, well, it sounds like there's really good work going on in New Jersey, Sue. That's really exciting. My conversations have, I think, raised some really legitimate points. For example, in Maine, a lot of the more hardcore Democrats and the party didn't want independents to be able to be delegates for the party, for example, which I think makes sense, but they still wanted they wanted to make sure that independent votes would still count towards the party's delegate vote. So they're kind of all like these wonky details about how the state party operates that the party really wanted to protect, and I was okay with that. And so had a lot of it was through my conversations with legislators that those concerns really came up, and we were able to protect that while still pushing forward with a really strong open primary bill. I think that there's just a lot of concern about equity as well. You know, we're kind of in this austerity moment in our country right now, and people don't want anyone else to have more than they have. So we've done a lot of work with our amendments to make sure that you know, a Democrat couldn't show up on election day, unenroll, and then go vote in the Republican Party primary, and making sure that that kind of conniving stuff couldn't happen. But I think that the heart of it has just been pointing to some of the data and just really trying to show that both parties are going to lose out if we don't start listening to voters who are unenrolled and just not part of our party, and how that's going to be so detrimental to us in the long run. You know, Maine is a very, very purple state, and so it's really important for the legislature to be in a place where we can understand all of those views in a much more thorough way.
I'm a little less optimistic. I guess I'm glad I'm in a state where we have initiative and referendum. We've tried to use it a number of times to because at the end of the day, I think you can't fix the system. You can't fix the basic problems in our governments until you change the way we elect our leaders. When I've gone to, I wrote our city charter for the city of Sioux Falls here in South Dakota. And now when I go to the people elected in that system with ideas like ranked choice voting, they're not open to it. They're creatures of the current system. They were elected by the current system, and they don't want to talk about reform. So I'm, like I say, I'm thankful I'm in a state where reform can come from outside, because working up through the system, you have a much bigger task ahead of you, Sue. And I guess the only way to get it done is probably with groundswell support from the voters, where the parties compete with each other to try and please the voters by doing it.
Thank you.
You know, Sue, just to add one thing, from having worked with Joe in South Dakota and kind of watched what Chloe is organizing in Maine, both of them very successfully have brought in the voice of veterans into the conversation, to both states with high numbers of veterans. I don't know what that looks like in New Jersey, but Chloe, for example, just organized or participated in an event where veterans spoke about why it's important to them to register as independents, because they serve the country, not a party, and yet they're denied access. And Eric Bronner, who's on the call today, is kind of taking the lead on that issue nationally. But I would encourage you to take a look at what are the dynamics with veterans in New Jersey in terms of numbers of registered voters, percentages, things like that, because that voice is very hard for legislators to ignore.
Cool. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. A number of people, I'm just going to ask this question for a number of people. It's kind of an informational question, but a number of people have asked about the difference between open primaries and semi-open primaries. So Chloe and Joe, can you give us a tutorial?
Do you want to do it, Joe, or do you want me to?
Since I'm clueless, I'd prefer you do it, Chloe.
Okay. So open primaries are kind of like a free-for-all. Anyone could vote for anyone in any party on primary day. And semi-open primaries are a little bit more restrictive and would just allow unenrolled voters to choose one of the parties in which to participate in the primary without changing their party status. So it's like half open.
Yeah, another way I've heard it is in some ways the difference is not so much between open primaries and semi-open, it's between open partisan primaries and open nonpartisan primaries, you know, and I think that's like the most important distinction. All right, more questions. Dennis from Florida has a question, and he's decided to keep it a secret. So this is a secret question. Go ahead, Dennis. It truly is a secret. He's not only not telling us what it is, but not saying what it is. All right. A question from Staten Island, New York. Julia Hemsworth has a question about the rise of independent voters. Go ahead, Julia.
Hi. According to Gallup, for a while now, the number of independent voters across the country has, it bounces around, but it's consistently been 40% or above across the country for a while now. And I was curious if this trend towards independence is being acknowledged by the two parties. And if so, if that is affecting the conversations that the parties are having about open primaries.
All I can speak to is in my state, the number of independents is about a quarter of the registered voters because they are forced to make a choice or not have a relevant vote. To vote in the primary, you have to pick a party. And again, I've run into the same thing that Chloe described earlier, that if you suggest that maybe we should do something about those independents, people in power say, well, they should pick a party. It's a little like picking a religion. Nobody should be forced to pick which Lutheran church they want to go to.
Yeah, I think that the parties are I mean, I'll just speak for the Democratic Party in Maine because that's where my knowledge is on this one. But I think that there's definitely a growing awareness, acknowledgement of that. But I think it's also one of the things that I didn't appreciate until I was in office is just, you know, you're campaigning, and most Democrats in Maine are from safer districts. So, but not all, certainly. So, you know, you're just kind of mostly talking to Democrats, and then you get elected and, you know, you're in your caucus with all Democrats, and most of your allies are Democrats. And so kind of by the way the system is set up, you end up just really interacting with mostly Democrats. And I think it's hard, you know, so I think that's where the groupthink comes from. It's just kind of like an unintentional consequence. But I think it's also one of the reasons why it's hard to get these new perspectives in there and be like, oh, this community that you're part of, that's really important and valid. But maybe we need to expand it and invite all of these other voices who could change what this looks like. And I think that's an understandably tricky conversation to have. But I think, like you were just talking about, the data is so clearly pointing to a different direction. And I think the Democratic Party is really reckoning with how to evolve with independent voters, and at least from my perspective, how to evolve with rural voters who are clearly not having what the Democratic Party is putting down these days. So for both parties to survive, there needs to be that self-awareness. And I think this is one of the best ways to do that. I mean, when you have independents voting in primaries, it's going to change the primary conversation. It's going to change who gets elected. It's just going to totally change the dynamic in ways that I think are really healthy and needed.
All right, we have a question from John in South Dakota who has a question for Chloe in Maine. Go ahead, John. And then we're going to go back to Tony in Florida, whose audio, or Dennis rather, whose audio is back up and working. But take it away, John.
Thanks for participating here, Senator. This has been very enlightening. I was hoping you could reflect just a little bit on Maine's leadership and experience in its RCV experiment, and what is the status of the attacks on RCV in Maine? We know that it is under attack, which is the way it happens, I guess.
That's such a good question, John. Yeah, we're proud of our ranked choice voting here. But it still feels quite new to folks. I mean, the ballot looks really different, and a lot of folks have trouble with it. I think the instructions on the ballot have gotten a lot clearer, but I've certainly sat down in many people's kitchen, and I've pulled up the ballot on my phone and walked them through how to rank people. The biggest pushback is one person, one vote, but you can still vote for just one person with ranked choice voting. So right. There are consistently attacks on it. It's tricky because it's in our Constitution, so it will always require 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate to change it or add it or get rid of it. And that's a tricky bar. So I think it's safe. I think it's safe for now, and it's really catching on. And certainly the argument that I use is that ranked choice voting is one of the ways that we kind of break down the two-party power structure and really make it more accessible for independent folks to run for office, without getting elected with 20 or 30% of the vote or whatever it might end up being. It's not very representative.
Thanks, Chloe. All right, we're going to go Dennis in Florida, Benjamin in Florida, and then we're going over to Bill in Georgia and wrap things up. So Dennis, go ahead, take it away.
Thank you, John. I hope everyone can hear me. I had a little bit of a technical difficulty before. Unfortunately, I missed the first part of the meeting. I had a conflict and I was a little late to join. And this is a topic that is extremely dear to my heart. And I noticed the other gentleman who's following me here is from Florida. I was going to ask that question. Is there anyone else from Florida on the call? As I've listened here, I've learned, rechecking it, Maine has 1.3 million people, Alaska 731,000. We have a grand total, unfortunately, I think, for purposes of this issue, of 22 million in Florida. In the recent November election, for those of you who might not have been familiar with what was going on in Florida, we have voter initiative and referendum here, and open primaries was on the ballot. And it was polling, allegedly, very well. We need a supermajority here of 60% in order for a constitutional amendment to pass. And it got 57%. And this was far and away the most critically important election to me. And this issue has been mine for 20 years. I'm a lifelong and very proud no party affiliation voter. And I've come to the conclusion, is this a question? Well, I'll get to the question. I got so many questions of you people that have successfully achieved this in other states. We were polling very well. In talking with a former Florida congressman just 2 weeks ago, who is contemplating and has contemplated a statewide run as an independent. He and I are talking, and hopefully we'll continue to talk. It looked like we were going to pass open primaries. And then in the weeks before the election, the incoming Speaker of the Florida House of Representatives, a Republican, and a Democratic senator from right here in the Tampa Bay area where I'm from, much to my chagrin, the two of them joined in a lawsuit to try to kick the open primary referendum off the ballot. Laurel Lee, the Republican Secretary of State, to her ultimate credit, answered the brief of theirs and went to the Florida Supreme Court, which you all may or may not know, has been recently stacked by Republican Governor Ron DeSantis with new appointees, some of which President Trump immediately took off the Florida Supreme Court and put them on federal appellate positions. So Mr. DeSantis has had an opportunity not to stack the court but once, but twice. Anyway, the Republican Speaker of the House and the Florida senator from here joined in this lawsuit, which I'm proud to report, even with what might have been perceived as a somewhat
All right, Dennis, you got 15 seconds.
All right. In any event, you mentioned open versus semi-open. What's a jungle primary? I'm assuming that is a wide open primary. I'll direct this to whoever there is able to answer that question.
I can take point on this. Jungle refers, I mean, none of this is precise, but jungle refers to what they have in Louisiana, which is they have a primary that is open to all voters and all candidates run, but it takes place on election day. So the primary is actually on November 3rd. There isn't a primary in the spring or the fall. And if no candidate gets 50% of the vote, it goes to the general election. But the word jungle is also used to describe the California top two system, mostly by opponents who want to tar it as a bad system. But I think Louisiana is where they proudly refer to it as a jungle primary system, because essentially there's no party primaries at all.
Can I, one quick follow-up, the Florida initiative, and I didn't understand why, I still don't. It was a top two. Right. And a gentleman who was pushing that in Florida, Steve Van Coor, on one of these similar things we're listening to here, said that one had passed. The reason they picked two and not more than two, and I think it should be more than two, was because that had apparently passed constitutional muster with the US Supreme Court, was my understanding. Do you know anything about that?
Yes, it did. It passed I believe, a number of cases, Tasjian and Jones, and Washington State versus Grange in 2005, where the Supreme Court ruled that because the purpose of a nonpartisan primary is not to choose a party nominee, that it does not violate First Amendment freedom of association. So it is indeed the only form of open primary to pass constitutional muster.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, Benjamin, Aubrey in Florida. And then we're going to go to Dennis in Georgia to wrap, or I'm sorry, Bill in Georgia to wrap things up. Go ahead, Benjamin.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you all for hosting this meeting. And second, I was actually gonna reference the attempted referendum in the last election for open primaries. And something that I found out fairly recently was a lot of the third parties, Libertarian and Green Party, for example, they were opposed from the start with the initiative. So this is more of a question for both Joe and Chloe. Are there any, I guess, strategies to try to promote open primaries in which other third parties, as well as the top Republican and Democratic parties, would be able to support it as well? And maybe that could help us in Florida in promoting open primaries down here again sometime.
I can only speak to, in South Dakota, we're trying to build up our election reform group right now. Our initial focus is on ranked choice voting, and there the Libertarians have been very supportive. They see this as a way to, get people to vote for their candidate first, and then second vote would go to either the Republican or the Democrat. So I think election reform is appealing to third parties or fourth parties because it gives them a chance to do better than they're doing now.
Yeah, and I think too, in a semi-open primary model, an independent could still go in and have a, if there was a primary for the Libertarian or the Green Party, they could go in and participate in that primary. And I know in Maine, we're trying to, in the long run, have lower barriers for some of those third parties to have ballot access and make it easier for folks to be able to run as third party candidates.
Thank you both.
All right, Bill from Georgia has a question about after open primaries, what's next? Take it away, Bill. Final question of the day.
So can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So here in Georgia, we have nonpartisan registration. So it's not actually possible to declare a party when you register, and all primaries are basically open. My question is for Joe and Chloe, what is next after you achieve open primaries? What is, which democracy reforms are you going to be thinking about as, the most important step after open primaries?
I have not gotten there yet. I gotta be honest, but I will very soon.
And I'm kind of in the same boat. I guess I think if we can just get our first step done with any election reform, we'll start to make progress and move forward. I don't have what the end game, I guess, is nirvana.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Chloe. Thank you, everyone who joined us today and or watched on Facebook. This has been a great conversation. A link to it will be up on YouTube tomorrow if you want to share it with friends and colleagues. We're busy programming our summer Zoom series, so stay tuned for more interesting conversations in the months to come. Again, thank you all for participating and have a great day.